When gold falls, silver collapses, and private credit quietly breaks at the same time. It is rarely coincidence. In my experience, markets don't move randomly. They move because a system is being stressed. What most investors focus on is price. What matters far more is the machine behind the price. Every financial system operates through cause and effect, leverage and constraints, incentives and reactions. When multiple gears begin to grind at once, it tells us the system is approaching a transition point in the cycle. The purpose here is not to predict headlines, but to understand the mechanics driving what comes next. Most people approach financial risk by asking whether a specific event will happen. Will gold be confiscated? Will history repeat 1933? In my experience, this is not how systems work. Systems do not repeat events. They repeat functions. When you study history carefully, you see that the same problems appear again and again, but the mechanisms used to resolve them evolve with the structure of the system itself. In 1933, the United States operated under a gold-anchored monetary system. The dollar was a claim on gold, and the supply of money was constrained by the amount of metal held by the government. When the system became stressed by deflation, debt, and collapsing confidence, the government pulled the most direct lever available. It centralized gold, revalued it, and expanded the money supply. That action made sense within the mechanics of that system. Today, the system is fundamentally different. Money is no longer constrained by gold. It is constrained by confidence, regulation, and political tolerance. If a system no longer requires a component to function, it will not expend energy trying to seize it. This is why I believe focusing on a repeat of 1933 misses the point. The real question is not whether gold will be taken, but how the modern system reallocates wealth when it is under pressure. When I analyze any system, I start by identifying its primary objectives and its available levers. Governments today face historically high debt levels, long-term entitlement obligations, and slowing productivity growth. These pressures create a need to redirect resources back into the system. If taking assets directly creates social instability, the system will search for alternatives that achieve the same effect with less friction. This is where cause and effect matter. If an asset appreciates significantly during periods of systemic stress, it becomes visible. Visibility leads to political attention. Political attention leads to policy. This is not ideology. It is mechanics. The system does not ask whether something is fair. It asks whether something is effective. History shows us that when systems evolve, control becomes more indirect, not less. The blunt tools of the past give way to more sophisticated mechanisms that operate through incentives, access, and rules rather than force. This is how complex systems maintain stability while appearing to respect individual choice. I always ask myself a simple question: how do I know I am right? The answer is never certainty. It is probability, based on historical cycles, legal structures, and incentive alignment. The probability of a dramatic, visible confiscation event is low. The probability of quieter, system-level adjustments is much higher. Understanding this distinction is critical. If you prepare for the wrong risk, you will pull the wrong lever in your own decision-making. Pain comes from misunderstanding how the machine works. Progress comes from studying it honestly, even when the conclusions are uncomfortable. When systems come under financial stress, they look for ways to rebalance themselves. They do not do this emotionally. They do it mechanically. If direct action creates resistance, the system searches for indirect levers that produce the same result with less friction. This is an important principle to understand because it explains why modern forms of wealth redistribution rarely look like the dramatic events people fear. In a highly leveraged, debt-driven system, governments face a simple constraint: They must fund obligations that exceed future cash flows. When this happens, there are only a few levers available. You can cut spending, which is politically painful. You can grow productivity, which is slow and uncertain. Or you can increase revenues by redefining what is taxable. Historically, systems choose the path of least resistance. This is where taxation becomes a functional substitute for confiscation. If an asset class performs exceptionally well during a period when the system as a whole is under strain, that asset becomes a natural pressure point. The logic is straightforward. If gains appear disconnected from labor or productive contribution, they can be reframed as windfalls. Once reframed, they can be taxed more aggressively without destabilizing public support. This pattern is not theoretical. We have seen it repeatedly across cycles. Extraordinary profits in oil, real estate, and capital markets have often been followed by extraordinary tax regimes. The language changes, but the function remains the same. The system redirects value from areas of visible accumulation back into areas of perceived necessity. At a more granular level, this logic applies not only to national governments, but also to subsystems within them. States, regions, and municipalities operate under similar constraints, but with fewer tools. When these subsystems face fiscal stress, they focus on assets that are difficult to relocate and easy to identify. Physical wealth falls into this category. If mobility becomes a problem, mechanisms such as exit taxes appear. These are not ideological innovations. They are mechanical responses to capital flight. I often ask myself how I can test whether this reasoning is sound. One way is to examine incentives. Policymakers are not rewarded for ideological purity. They are rewarded for stabilizing budgets and maintaining social order. If taxing appreciation achieves both objectives with minimal disruption, it becomes a high probability outcome. This does not mean such policies are inevitable. It means their probability rises as systemic stress increases. Investors make mistakes when they treat political risk as binary. Systems rarely flip switches. They adjust dials. The key insight here is subtle but important. Wealth does not need to be taken to be diminished. It only needs to be constrained, diluted, or delayed. Over time, these effects compound. The result feels similar to confiscation. Even though the process looks orderly and legal, pain comes from expecting systems to behave differently than they have throughout history. Reflection comes from recognizing the patterns early. Progress comes from positioning yourself in a way that respects how the machine actually works, rather than how you wish it worked. To understand the next stage of this system, it helps to focus on where control actually resides. In every economic system, power does not come from ownership alone. It comes from control over flows. Who can transact, how value moves, under what conditions it is allowed to move. History shows that as systems become more complex and more indebted, control over flows becomes more important than control over assets. This is where central bank digital currencies fit into the machine. CBDCs are often discussed as a technological upgrade. I believe that framing misses the point. They are not primarily a payment innovation. They are an evolution in the operating system of money itself. When money becomes digital and programmable, the system gains the ability to apply rules directly to economic behavior rather than relying on blunt after-the-fact enforcement. If money can be tracked in real time, it can be regulated in real time. If it can be programmed, it can be constrained. Spending can be encouraged or discouraged. Transactions can be delayed, reviewed, or denied. This does not require malicious intent. It simply reflects a system trying to maintain stability under stress by tightening feedback loops. This has important implications for assets that sit outside the core monetary system. Gold and silver may continue to exist as stores of value, but their usefulness depends on their ability to interface with the dominant payment rails. If converting a physical asset into usable currency becomes subject to increased friction, oversight, or delay, its effective liquidity declines. In system terms, the asset still exists, but its flow rate is reduced. I often frame this as a question: what matters more, owning value or being able to deploy it? In a system where access is controlled, the second becomes increasingly important. History suggests that systems rarely need to seize assets outright if they can regulate how and when those assets are used. I test this reasoning by asking how the incentives align. Policymakers are incentivized to increase transparency, reduce illicit flows, and maintain macro stability. Programmable money serves these goals. Once implemented, it naturally extends into areas that are politically sensitive but economically significant. High-value asset transactions become an obvious focus. This is why I believe the endgame does not look like confiscation. It looks like compliance, more documentation, more verification, more conditions. Each step feels reasonable in isolation. Together, they change the character of ownership. When I reflect on past cycles, I see the same pattern repeated. Direct control gives way to indirect control. Force gives way to rules. The system evolves to minimize resistance while maximizing effectiveness. The pain for investors comes from confusing legal ownership with functional freedom. Reflection comes from recognizing where the true levers are moving. Progress comes from adapting to that reality early, rather than arguing with it late. As always, I ask myself how I could be wrong. The answer lies in watching the system's incentives. If control over flows continues to concentrate, then this path becomes increasingly probable, understanding that probability is more useful than fearing a single dramatic event. The most dangerous problems in any system are rarely the ones everyone is watching. They are usually the ones growing quietly in the background, where leverage accumulates faster than understanding. In past cycles, I have learned that when something is opaque, lightly regulated, and rapidly expanding, it deserves disproportionate attention. Today, private credit fits that description. Private credit exists because the traditional banking system became constrained. After the last major crisis, banks were forced to reduce risk, hold more capital, and accept tighter oversight. The demand for credit did not disappear. It simply migrated. Hedge funds, private equity firms, and asset managers stepped in to fill the gap. Mechanically, this looks like innovation. Systemically, it looks like risk moving to a darker corner of the machine. At first glance, private credit appears separate from the banking system. In reality, it is deeply connected. The funding often originates from banks. The risk is redistributed through structured products and derivatives. The exposure becomes harder to trace, but it does not disappear. This is a familiar pattern. When risk is dispersed without transparency, it feels manageable until it is not. Recent volatility in silver provides a useful illustration of how leverage behaves under stress. When margin requirements rise, leverage participants are forced to sell, regardless of fundamentals. This creates sharp, mechanical price moves. The same cause and effect logic applies to credit markets. When conditions tighten, refinancing becomes harder. When refinancing fails, defaults rise. When defaults rise, confidence breaks. I often think back to 2007, not because the details are identical, but because the structure rhymes. Back then, subprime risk was considered contained. It was spread, sliced, and insured. What people underestimated was correlation. When the cycle turned, everything moved together. The lesson was not about mortgages. It was about leverage combined with opacity. If private credit begins to unwind in a meaningful way, the pressure will flow back toward the core of the system. Banks will face indirect losses. Liquidity will tighten. Policymakers will be forced to choose between allowing contraction or intervening. History suggests they will intervene. But intervention always comes with conditions. This is where the concept of bail-ins becomes relevant. In highly indebted systems, transferring losses to depositors becomes more politically palatable than endless bailouts. This is not a prediction. It is a description of the menu of options that appear late in debt cycles. The system does not ask what is fair. It asks what is necessary to survive. I ask myself how confident I am in this assessment. I look at incentives, balance sheets, and historical precedent. The combination of high leverage, limited transparency, and slowing growth increases the probability of stress. That does not mean collapse is imminent. It means fragility is rising. Pain emerges when investors assume stability where none exists. Reflection comes from recognizing the early signals. Progress comes from adjusting exposure before the system is forced to do it for you. When systems enter periods of stress and transition, opportunities do not disappear. They change form. In my experience, the biggest mistake investors make during these phases is seeking certainty instead of structure. Markets do not reward certainty. They reward those who understand how incentives, costs, and constraints interact within the machine. In an environment where confidence in money weakens and debt pressures rise, assets tied to real value tend to regain importance. Gold and silver have historically played that role. But owning the metal itself is only one way to express that view. Another way is through businesses that extract that value from the ground. These businesses operate as leveraged expressions of the underlying asset. The logic is mechanical. Mining companies have relatively fixed costs. Labor, energy, equipment, and infrastructure do not fluctuate in direct proportion to metal prices. When the price of gold or silver rises, revenue increases faster than costs. This creates operating leverage. A modest increase in the underlying asset can translate into a disproportionate increase in cash flow and equity value. The same mechanism works in reverse, which is why discipline matters. I approach this not by selecting stories, but by applying principles. The first principle is cost. If a company cannot produce profitably at conservative price assumptions, it is fragile. Low all-in sustaining costs provide margin of safety. The second principle is growth. Mines deplete. Companies that cannot replace or expand production slowly decay. The third principle is jurisdiction. Political and legal systems are part of the machine. Stability matters more than optimism. The fourth principle is balance sheet strength. In volatile cycles, access to capital determines survival. Companies with excessive debt lose optionality at the worst possible time. The fifth principle is maturity. Producers operate. Developers promise. Both have a place, but their risk profiles are fundamentally different. Confusing the two is a common source of pain. I weigh these factors together rather than in isolation. This is what I refer to as believability-weighted decision-making. No single metric tells the full story. But when multiple indicators align, probability shifts in your favor. The goal is not to eliminate risk. It is to choose which risks you are being paid to take. I also remind myself that timing matters less than positioning. Trying to predict short-term price movements is difficult and often unnecessary. What matters more is whether you are aligned with the dominant forces of the cycle. If monetary systems are being pressured, assets connected to real value tend to benefit over time. Mining equities provide one structured way to express that view. As always, I ask how I could be wrong. If costs rise faster than prices, if political conditions deteriorate, if the cycle resolves through unexpected productivity gains, these possibilities exist, and they must be monitored. That is why diversification and risk management are essential. Pain comes from chasing leverage without structure. Reflection comes from understanding where leverage works for you rather than against you. Progress comes from building exposure that can survive volatility while participating in long-term shifts in the system. As I step back and look at the full picture, I see a system moving through a familiar phase of its long-term cycle: high debt, rising leverage, slowing growth, and increasing intervention are not anomalies. They are recurring features of late cycle dynamics. The specific events change, but the underlying mechanics remain remarkably consistent across history. The mistake many investors make at this stage is reacting to headlines instead of positioning for probabilities. Systems rarely break suddenly. They tighten, adapt, and reconfigure. Wealth is not destroyed all at once. It is gradually redirected through rules, incentives, and access. Understanding this allows you to replace fear with clarity. The first practical principle is diversification across systems, not just assets. Holding different types of value is useful, but holding them across different legal, political, and financial jurisdictions adds resilience. When pressure builds in one part of the machine, flexibility elsewhere becomes invaluable. The second principle is proximity and control. In highly intermediated systems, ownership can become abstract. Layers of contracts, custodians, and promises introduce fragility. The closer you are to the asset, the fewer assumptions you need to make about how it behaves under stress. Complexity is not your friend during transitions. The third principle is liquidity under constraint. Liquidity is not just about being able to sell. It is about being able to act when conditions change. Assets that appear liquid in calm periods can become illiquid when rules shift. Planning for this is not pessimism. It is realism. I also remind myself that no system moves in a straight line. There will be counter trends, relief rallies, and periods where fears appear misplaced. These do not invalidate the broader cycle. They are part of how systems release pressure without collapsing. The goal is not to predict each move, but to remain aligned with the dominant forces shaping outcomes over time. Throughout my career, I have relied on one simple formula: pain plus reflection equals progress. Pain signals that a system is changing. Reflection allows you to learn from that signal rather than fight it. Progress comes from adjusting your behavior before the system forces you to. I continually ask myself how I know my thinking is sound. I stress test it against history. I look for disconfirming evidence. I weigh opinions based on believability, not confidence. And I accept that being wrong is part of the process, as long as I learn faster than the environment changes. This is not a time for extreme optimism or extreme pessimism. It is a time for thoughtful positioning. By understanding how the machine works, where the levers are moving, and which probabilities are rising, you can navigate uncertainty with greater confidence and less emotion. In the end, successful investing is not about predicting the future. It is about understanding systems well enough to evolve alongside them.